Today we're going to be talking about between and within treatment variability. All right, here's how we're going to do this. First, we're going to talk about sort of what all experiments have in common, just a recap. And then we're going to talk about two types of variability within experiments. And that's going to be between treatment variability and within treatment variability. And then we're going to reframe the goal of all experiments in terms of variability. And then we're going to talk about different types of random assignment or different types of control that will help us control certain kinds of variability. And those three different kinds of random assignment are these: completely randomized design, matched pairs design, and repeated measures design. Okay. So the first thing about experimental designs is that all of them have two things in common. One is that they have manipulation and control of the treatment variable, right? Or what we call the IV, or the independent variable, right? So they all have that in common. Now, concretely, what that really translates to is that each experimental unit, whatever that unit is, be it a rat or a cell or a city or a state or a person, right? Each experimental unit or case gets assigned to some treatment, right? So this rat gets treatment A, this rat gets treatment B, this rat gets treatment A, this rat gets treatment B. Now, everything in this experiment should be alike except for the treatments. So everything else about these rats or states or schools or people should be roughly similar except for the treatment. And that's how we isolate the effect of that treatment. All right. So given that experimental overview, there's really two kinds of variability that we need to think about. One is what we call between treatment variability. And you could think of it as here are two groups that have two different treatments, A and B. And we want to know, hey, what's the between group variability? How are these two treatments different from each other? Or three treatments or four treatments? This variability is hopefully caused by the treatment, right? So the impact that the treatment is making on these two different cases or experimental units, that's really caused by the treatment. And so this is what we think of as the good kind of variability. This is the variability we're interested in. We are looking for this type of variability. Because if we have a lot of between treatment variability, this must mean that our manipulated variable is quite important. It makes an impact. Okay. Now, so that's one kind of variability. The other kind of variability is within treatment variability. That means within the experimental units that all have the same treatment. So it's all rats that were exposed to the same hours of sleep, right? And these rats had different hours of sleep, right? So these rats that all have the same hours of sleep, there's still some little differences between them, right? Like some rats might just sleep a little bit more or be a little more active or whatever it is, right? So they have a little bit of within treatment variability that will just come along for the ride. And so despite rigorous experimental methodology, no matter how good your manipulation and control is, there will be some variability that will exist even within a treatment group. And that could come from lots of different sources. Sometimes it does come from experimental mistakes and sloppiness, but most of the time it just comes from noise or other variables that we're not accounting for. So this is what we think of as bad variability, but it's not just bad as in like, oh, we want to, if you have it, then, oh, you're a terrible experimenter. No, that's not what it means. It just means that this gets in the way of seeing the good kind, of seeing the between treatment variability. See, here's the problem. Within treatment variability is very difficult to avoid. I mean, there are going to be some techniques to try and avoid it and minimize it as much as possible, and we're going to learn about those. But overall, we want, even though you try and reduce it, it probably never completely goes away. Here's the issue with it. It prevents us from seeing the between treatment variability because sometimes it obscures it. So let me show you what that means in not this slide, but the next slide. So because of this, because of these two different kinds of variability, we want to update sort of the goal of experimental design. Not only do we need to have manipulation and control of the IV in order to determine causality, right? Because we're very interested in causality in experiments, right? So this is all in order to determine causality. But also, we want to lower as much as possible within treatment variability, as much as we possibly can. And so there are going to be a couple of different methods for lowering within treatment variability as much as we can, because that's going to help us see between treatment differences. And that's what we're really interested in order to determine causality. All right, so let's look at an example to look at how these variabilities might impact each other. So here's an example of drugs and driving. So some antihistamines, like allergy medicines, make people feel drowsy, right, like Benadryl. One danger is that drowsy people are crappy drivers. To check whether an antihistamine makes people worse at driving, we wanted to test an antihistamine against a placebo, just a sugar pill, on people's driving performance in a video game. Well, here's like sort of the ideal case. In the ideal case, in order to determine whether antihistamines cause people to be like crappy drivers, one thing you might want to look at is, let's say, the score on the driving performance. So higher score means you're better at driving. Lower score means you had more like crashes or swerves or whatever it was, right? And so maybe we'll see, if we draw like a dot plot of the antihistamine people, right? Maybe we'll see them all having sort of, you know, low scores, right? Right? Maybe one guy gets a high score, right? But maybe the placebo group will just tend to all get sort of, most of them tend to get high scores, right? So if we had something like this, then we see that even though there's within treatment variability, right? So there's variability here, right? There's some within treatment variability here, and there's some within treatment variability here too, right? But basically the means are probably far apart enough where we could probably say, oh, look, the antihistamines, they seem to be sort of different than the placebo group, right? And so that between treatment difference is still big enough that we could see it. But the world is not an ideal place, right? So sometimes, actually most of the time, we have a sort of noisy world because, you know, some people are just better at driving games and some people are better at video games and some people don't react to antihistamines as strongly as other people, right? So there's lots of places, lots of other variables that come into play for within treatment variability. And so maybe we might have, you know, differences, but okay? So maybe we have a lot of spread, right? So we have a whole lot of spread here, right? And among the placebo group, we might also have a whole lot of spread. So in this case, it's sort of hard to see if there is a between treatment difference just because there's a lot of within treatment difference, right? And that's what we mean by it's sort of a bad kind of variability. It gets in our way of really being able to make conclusions from our experiment, right? And so what we want to do is reduce that within treatment variability as much as we possibly can. So to conclude that a treatment, some experimental treatment makes a big enough impact, what you really have to see is that the between treatment variability is greater, is overcoming the within treatment variability, right? So the between treatment variability has to come out strong, and the within treatment variability has to be sort of smaller, right? And so when we see that, then we could maybe start to have some more confidence in saying, hey, I think this treatment might make a difference. All right. So in order to reduce within treatment variability as much as possible, there's a couple of different types of designs for random assignment that we could carry out. So all experiments have random assignment of treatments to experimental units or cases, right? And I'm calling them experimental units here just because there's so many different things that you could do experiments on, right? Like you could do experiments on whole companies, and you could do experiments on individual people. So I just try to generally call them units, right, or cases. So the one type that we've already talked about so far is what we call a completely random design, right? And this just means you randomly assign a treatment to each unit, right? So each little experimental unit gets randomly assigned to a treatment. And the only requirement other than that is that you keep the number of units that are given each treatment as equal as possible, right? So treatment A, B, and C all have the same number of experimental units that get each of those. And that's the only requirement. That's it. Right? And the way you could think about this is like this. Let's say you have experimental units A, B, C, D, E, F, right? And you have two treatment groups, treatment 1 and treatment 2, right? So when A comes in, you think about it as, flipping a coin, right? And whatever they get, heads for team 1, tails for team 2. So it might be A, B, C, D, E, F, right? So something like that. And so you just randomly assign them to different treatment groups. And so that one's just really pretty easy and straightforward. The other kinds are what we call generally randomized block design. Randomized block design. What we do here is first we have this additional step. We place similar units into groups, right? And we call those units in those groups, we call those blocks, right? And randomly assign treatments to the units within the block. So here's the general idea. So let's say A, B, and C are similar for some reason. Like they're, let's make it A, B, C, and D. They're all similar for some reason. They are, let's say, females, right? They're all females. And maybe we have E, F, G, H, and those are all males, right? And so first, we place similar units into groups. They're called blocks, right? So we have two blocks here. Once we have those blocks, then you randomly assign treatments to the units within each block. So maybe A will go, so here we might get, A, B, C, D, right? So they get randomly assigned to the treatments. And then also with E, F, G, and H, you might get E, F, G, H, right? So they get randomly assigned to these treatment groups. So then you roughly have two treatments that have an equal number of females and an equal number of males, right? And so Whatever similarity you're interested in, you could use that. For instance, if you're interested in whether they are in the same grade level or if they have the same major, or sometimes it might be maybe rats from the same litter because those tend to be similar, or plants from the similar elevation level, right? So whatever those similarities are, you want to place them into groups first before assigning them to treatments, so that each group gets sort of equal representation in the two treatments. But actually, there's multiple different kinds of randomized block design, and so I'm going to show you two of them.